Welcome everyone, good afternoon. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Casey Van Drehle, who's a second-year child and adolescent psychiatry clinical fellow at UCSF. He attended A.T. Still University in Kirksville, Missouri for medical school and completed his psychiatry residency at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. He has a focus in treating transgender and gender diverse youth. He trained at the Gender Clinic at the Mayo Clinic and is currently involved with the Child and Adolescent Gender Clinic here at UCSF. He's a student member of the World Professional Association for Transgender Health and a member of Mind the Gap. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Casey Van Drehle. Thank you for being here today. Take it away.
Thank you. All right, let me share my screen here. All right. Everyone can see that? Okay. In 1 second. I have to move all of these faces. Apologies. All right, here we go. Well, welcome everyone to today's talk. The title of my talk is Double Helix Rainbow Kids, Autism and Gender Diversity. This phrase, Double Helix Rainbow Kids, was coined by Diane Ehrensaft, who will be graciously joining us today as well. It is a phrase used to describe a long-held suspicion in gender centers that there is an overlap between people who are both gender diverse and on the autism spectrum. By the way, I'll be using the phrases gender diverse, gender creative, transgender, non-binary rather interchangeably today. The goals of today's talk will be to discuss the connection between gender diversity and autism spectrum disorder, hear about the unique presentations and cases that wonderfully challenge the stereotypical concept of gender, identify barriers to care, gain some resources, and then most importantly, my favorite goal would be to reinforce how great it is to care for these beautiful humans. And before we get into it, I do want to read this statement, nothing about us without us. This is a topic, this topic is not my lived experience. I'm cisgender, I do not have ASD. I am, however, a clinician, an ally, and an advocate. I know these topics are emotionally and politically charged, and for outsiders, you can feel fragility and occasionally feel like you're walking on eggshells. It happens to me. But what I don't want is to be another privileged cisgender white guy telling it like it is to communities that I don't directly identify with. For there's good reason for the emotional charge. These communities have been burned before. There's significant trauma, plenty of which is at the hands of our own profession. There's reason to be suspicious of providers who don't live within these communities. So it is important to first thoughtfully listen to these wonderfully diverse individuals, and then try and be supportive and be a knowledgeable ally and clinician. You won't get it right 100% of the time. I know I don't, but acknowledge it. These fields are constantly evolving, and my desire is to evolve with them. And these communities do desperately need informed clinicians. If you get anything from this imperfect talk, my hope is that you won't shy away from asking about gender and neurodiversity with your patients. Diane said something great last Sunday at our Mind the Gap meeting, and hopefully I'm not stealing any material, Diane, but she said something along the lines of, I can wait for hell to freeze over before some kids bring up their gender. Meaning we have to be proactive, which brings me to my next slide, which is why I have this talk. Why discuss ASD and gender diversity? We're all going to see patients in our clinics who are on the autism spectrum or transgender and non-binary. It is estimated by the CDC that 1 in 54 Children in the US have ASD, and as you can see from this graph, it is only increasing. Per the Wilms Institute, it is estimated that 0.7% of youth 13 to 17 identify as transgender. And there is a higher than chance crossover between the groups. This is a long held suspicion in many gender clinics. The good news is that now it's been well studied. So to quote our wonderful Chief Zio, it's a thing. Too much? I don't know. In August of 2020, the largest study to date was published by our mates over in Cambridge. They used nearly 642,000 individuals. These are from 5 independently recruited cross-sectional databases, all with various recruitment practices. And what they found was that transgender and gender diverse individuals were 3 to 6 times as likely to be autistic than cisgender individuals. They looked at this in numerous different ways. But they also found, for those who didn't hold the diagnosis, that an exploratory analysis identified that transgender and gender diverse individuals were more likely to report that they suspected they had undiagnosed autism as well. This had an odds ratio of about 4.5 or 5.5. Here are 2 graphs from the paper, which I thought were interesting. So these 2 graphs are from their largest data sets, and it's looking at the odds ratios of other psychiatric diagnoses with gender diverse individuals. What they found was there were increased rates for other neurodevelopmental disorders or psychiatric disorders such as ADHD, bipolar, learning disorder, OCD, schizophrenia. This is slightly different than the well-known increases in more socially driven illnesses such as depression, social anxiety, or substance use and SI. However, I would direct your focus to the blue dots. This is the model where they used to exclude autism, so then that attenuated the odds ratios down for the other mental health disorders. And then on this left graph, none of the other conditions were significantly elevated in transgender and gender diverse individuals after controlling for autism and depression. This graph showing for autism, but if you add depression, then the other ones were not statistically significant. So there's some discrepancy with the other disorders, and further research is needed to look beyond autism, which is what the paper's primary focus was. So why is this the case? Why might this be happening? Why is autism or gender diversity linked? Anyone want to hazard a guess, theory? You can type it into the chat. See if I can pull it up, or unmute if you're feeling brave. Any thoughts about why this connection is showing up? All right, Sleepy Wednesday. Well, we'll hope the next round, we'll get some participation. So considering the monumental task of determining the molecular mechanisms all the way up to societal factors that form these two very complex spectrums, we're definitely in the hypothesis stage. But there are some varying theories or hints at what might be occurring. One suggestion has been made that non-binary people might have a prolonged feeling of not fitting in socially, which could lead to higher reports of social interaction difficulties. This is a rather narrow hypothesis and doesn't explain other aspects of ASD, such as sensory sensitivity differences. But this hypothesis does hint at something Diane talks about, that it's important to think about the reverse, that it might not be an issue of the gender diverse individual fitting in with society, but rather the gender diverse person viewing gender without all the societal constraints. That a gender binary boy and girl is meaningless and they're just simply individuals. I'm going to read a quote from Dr. Ehrensaft, because as you will see, she is a much better writer than I am. We might also say that the neurodiverse cohort is freed from the societal constraints and bending mores of correct gender roles and behavior, allowing them a far more creative gender journey in line with the 21st century understanding of gender and its multiplicity and expansiveness, rather than its entrapment in two designated boxes. We might also say that it's not the autistic, but the neurotypical folks who are failing to read the social cues so poignantly provided by the neurodiverse community. So what about molecular mechanisms, genes, prenatal mechanisms such as hormone shaping brain development? Luckily, we have, and thankfully, we have two great ASD researchers here at UCSF. Dr. State and Dr. Manoli just put out an informative, hot off the press 2021 article in the Psychiatric Green Journal. I have to give a shout out to these two for the timing on this one. So here's the article. It does a great job speaking about ASD genetics and addressing theories behind the sexual dimorphism. I'm going to greatly cherry pick for the purposes of this talk, but I recommend giving it a read. And breaking it down into when and where of ASD pathogenesis, they mention the mid-gestational period most associated with ASD pathogenesis corresponds with high testosterone surges and possible period of sexual differentiation. So that was more the when, the what, or the wheres, but they looked at steroid hormone receptor transcription factors and their locations. And questions arose as to the connectivity of cortical and subcortical regions to places like the hypothalamus, which collectively might control sex typical displays of behavior. Luckily, they made a graph to help out. So they created this graph to show ASD pathobiology in green and sexual differentiation of the brain in pink and blue. As you can see, they're pretty close to each other and connected. All of this is to say, there's no direct links yet, but luckily there are very smart people researching this, and there are threads of molecular information that link gender development, mid-fetal brain development, and ASD. All right, audience, you're up again. Why do you think knowing some of this, or at least having a general understanding of some of these theories might be helpful?
Sometimes parents are pretty nuanced and they might ask about these things. And then they also might ask about, would my kid be gender diverse if they didn't have autism as well? So just, it's for parent information in some ways too. And then it's also for our own research benefit, so we can track these things and maybe figure out other ways to help.
Thanks, Chase. Absolutely. So it can really help provide understanding to parents and providers that might be struggling with their child's gender and neurodiversity. So it can provide some explanations that kind of help bring down the barriers to care, especially when parents might be dismissive because a child might be on one spectrum or the other. When I was starting my adult residency training, my first transgender patient asked me if they might have autism. A supervisor who had known this person previously for a long time, told me, no, it's likely an access 2 issue. This was an unfortunate misstep. The woman would come to every visit wearing a witch hat because the lights were too bright. There were clear signs of ASD, and sadly, it took me a while to learn that. At the time, I was a barrier to her care. She did eventually end up with a ASD diagnosis, but that was due to her own persistence. So in an attempt to educate and remove these barriers, the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, the National Center for Transgender Equality, and National LGBTQ Task Force put out a well-written joint statement clearly advocating for the rights of those with ASD to pursue gender-affirming care if so desired. Sadly, this was in response to the 2016 killing by police of Caden Clark, a transgender young man with ASD. Police were responding to a welfare check for SI, and prior to his death, Caden had encountered numerous roadblocks pursuing gender-affirming care due to his neurodiversity. One therapist basically told him that his ASD needed to be cured before he could approve for hormones. So a really sad story. And so they came out and made this statement and, had pretty strong statements such as everyone should be able to live as their gender they know themselves to be. An autistic people are no exception. Many people mistakenly believe that autistic people can't understand their gender or make decisions about how to express it. Some assume that if an autistic person doesn't identify with their gender identity, that is just a symptom of their autism. Denying transgender and gender nonconforming autistic people the respect, dignity, and equal access to services that they need can worsen the social marginalization that many of them face. And it can have serious health impacts and sometimes result in a tragedy. So what's our role in all this? What can access to supportive care accomplish? Because I promise there's a lot that can be done. This is one of the many aspects of why it's more people should come along and do this work. There's a well-known increase in depression, social anxiety, and SI in both these communities. Increased rates of suicide attempts in young people with ASD is 3.9 compared to the general average of 0.7. There's a 40% attempted suicide rate over a lifetime for gender diverse individuals. This can largely be attributed to minority stress and lack of support. So as promised, there are a lot of intervenable factors. So these are some of the major groups: social support, reducing transphobia, reducing stigma of ASD, personal identification documents changed to an appropriate gender designation, parental support, medical and surgical interventions. And just to give you a sense of the numbers, so these are pretty large. So for social support, there was, and these are all from a Canadian study, but these trends have been studied elsewhere as well. So for social support, 59% reduction in SI, 82% reduction in SA, transphobia and stigma of ASD, 66% reduction in SI, 76% reduction in SA. Just changing the documents to reflect the appropriate gender designation, 44% reduction in SI, 74% reduction in SA. Parental support is huge. This is studied, and there's several studies on this. And this Canadian study had 57% reduction, but I've seen all the way, into the 90s. Medical and surgical interventions, those, those can be teased apart. There's a little bit more to it, but for this study, showed those who had completed medical transition, so meaning that they were on hormones, and this is plus minus surgery, that there was a 62% reduction in SI. All right. I do want to give some resources. The UCSF has, obviously we have the Gender Center down at Benioff Children's Hospital that Diane Ehrensaft, along with a few others, started. What would you say? Was it 12 years ago now? Really awesome. There's the STAR clinic at LPPI, but though I heard there's a name change in the works. There's MDAC at Zuckerberg. There's this Mind the Gap, which I referred to earlier, is a monthly meeting group run by Diane, where providers of all different backgrounds and credentials come to discuss caring for gender diverse youth. Last week there was Diane brought a wonderful grandparents group, and it was so heartwarming to just see this group of wonderfully supporting grandparents who were also very open about their trials and tribulations of coming to support their kid and their grandkid. It was really special. This is obviously not their logo, but it's easy to remember. The part of the Mind the Gap is that there's a slick website, genderyouthproviders.com. It has listed a bunch of gender specialists in the Bay Area. I will say, unfortunately, I think that all mental health is experiencing right now is a huge surge in demand, and resources are getting slimmer and slimmer. But hopefully we can still do our best to try to connect these kids to appropriate providers. There's the Gender Spectrum, which is an online resource, has a lot of information, a lot of ways of which to connect with groups, good for families. The Dimensions Clinic is a clinic in SF that also sees Medi-Cal patients. And then there's a regional center for autism. For those who want to pick up some books, I got to give a plug to to these three authors. Finn Gratton is a therapist who identifies in both these communities and has written this great book supporting transgender autistic youth and adults. Got to give a shout out to Diane Ehrensaft's book, The Gender Creative Child. And lastly, there's Iris Gottlieb, who illustrated and wrote this pretty great, colorful, fantastic visualization of all that's in the gender spectrum. Here are some references. And now I get the pleasure to introduce Dr. Diane Ehrensaft for the second time in 2021. Dr. Diane Ehrensaft is a developmental and clinical pathologist, associate professor at pediatrics here at UCSF. She is the director of mental health of the Child and Adolescent Gender Center down at Children's Benioff. She has written numerous books, as you have seen, and she has given talks all over the world. Diane is presently co-investigator in a 4-site NIH grant studying the effects of puberty blockers and gender-affirming hormones in gender-expansive and transgender youth. She is also the principal investigator in a companion 4-site grant, the Gender Journey Project, studying the psychological effects of prepubertal gender-expansive children, also looking at some ASD factors in there as well. She has served on the faculty here at UCSF, as well as UC Berkeley, the Rights Institute, Psychoanalytical Institute of Northern California, and WPATH Global Education Initiative. She's the founding member and senior clinician of A Home Within, a national organization addressing the emotional needs of children in foster care. So without further ado, Dr. Ehrensaft, I will turn the floor over to you.
Okay.
I'll stop sharing.
All right.
There we go.
Well, thank you all for having me. And thank you so much, Casey, because I get to riff off of you. So I just want to start with saying how I came up with the term double helix rainbow kids. I was seeing a child in therapy who had been diagnosed on the autism spectrum, and I was doing a gender evaluation. And when I asked this little person who was 5, what pronouns I would want their teacher to put on their cubby when they started kindergarten, because that was about to happen, they looked at me in just kind of disgust and said, I don't know. And then they said, oh, just ask you to put rainbow kid. So when I thought about it, I thought, okay, there's 2 spectra going on here. There's autism spectrum, there's gender spectrum. So I put it together and came up with double helix rainbow kids. So now I want to walk us into our offices from everything that Casey was saying is, okay, so what happens there? And the first thing I would say is to underline what Casey made reference to, that sometimes when we have a double helix rainbow kid, it is not their difficulty reading social cues. It is our difficulty reading their cues. And so we really have to learn how to read the cues. One of the things for many kids who are on the autism spectrum, are neurodivergent, is when they're little, they often don't think about gender at all. So they may hear their parents say, you're a girl, you're a boy, but it doesn't have any meaning for them. So as one double helix rainbow kid told me, he said, when I was little, I did not think about gender at all. It was a category that had no meaning for me. I was just a person. And only when my body started to change, when I was 12, did I suddenly come to the startling and awful realization that I had a gender. I hated it, and I certainly didn't want to be the only, I certainly didn't want to be the one my body was telling me I was going to have to be. So the thing to remember, about double helix rainbow kids is gender may not come up as a thing until puberty is reached, because they're not really zeroing in on gender before. That's not true for all double helix rainbow kids, but it is so common for the first inkling of the thing of gender not to pop up until puberty or sometime in early adolescence. The other, I want to say the misconception that many people treating or raising double helix rainbow kids abide by is it's just one of their obsessive phases. Like they may be really obsessed with trucks for a while, now they're really obsessed with gender for a while. And indeed, there is, like with many gender expansive kids, an insistent, a consistent, and a persistent declaration. I am not the gender you think I am. I am another gender. It may look obsessive, as it does for many gender expansive kids who are not on the autism spectrum, because they're trying to get a point across until somebody hears them. So they drive it home with fervent declarations that look like obsessiveness, but they're really actually urgency. And the way we know that it is a myth is it doesn't go away. Phases go away. But what Kishi showed us about the intersection between being gender expansive and being gender divergent is a real documented intersection that is not a phase. It is a thing. So I think that's really important for anybody who has somebody coming into their office who is talking about gender and looks like they may be somewhere on the autism spectrum. And our job as clinicians is not to demand that they come into our world as we've been trained to understand gender, but for us to get into their world and not to demand that they conform to ours. So here'd be an example of that. If you ask neurodivergent youth during a gender evaluation, so how do you imagine you're going to present yourself differently after you transition from one gender to another? And this might be after they said, I'm a transgender guy. I'm not the girl everybody thought I was. So you say, okay, what's going to look like? What are you going to do in your transition? And they look at you blankly and go, well, nothing. I'm just going to be the same, but I'm a boy. And that is not a red flag that a child isn't ready to really understand what gender identity means. It means that for them, it has nothing to do with their outer presentation. Not paying attention to that at all. It's an inner sense of self. Now, what are the advantages and what are the disadvantages of being a double helix rainbow kid? Here are the advantages, in case you referred to this before, that you may be free from the proscriptions and the prescriptions of gender policing because you don't care about those social cues and you don't pay attention to them, or you weren't thinking about gender at all, so it just flew right by you. Secondly, often you have the freedom, if you are a neurodivergent individual of any age, to go to the beat of your own drum, to not pay attention to the social cues, but pay attention to your cues. And I want to say that this notion of social cues, absolutely, again, let's throw it out the window as Casey read in the quote from me before. So now let's talk about the disadvantages of being a double helix rainbow kid. Number one of the features that often comes with being a neurodivergent youth or adult is an exquisite self-consciousness or social anxiety. And sometimes really being inhibited or avoidant of social situations. That's also true for many people who are exploring their gender in a transphobic world, that depending on their temperament, that too may create a lot of social anxiety and a lot of self-consciousness. Second disadvantage, if you don't know how to get into the world of a neurodivergent, gender expansive person, and you yourself are neurotypical, you may be in a situation where you're facing somebody who has a difficulty putting in words what gender means to them. So they'll just say, it just is, and get very frustrated if you try to get a verbal narrative of the meaning of their gender, their authentic gender. So it becomes a disadvantage for them in the neurotypical world. Sometimes it is true that the black and white thinking that will come with some neurodivergent kids' development makes it sometimes hard to, although this sounds contradictory, to move away from rule-driven ideas and very binary notions of gender. So that sometimes can actually be a disadvantage. There's one last one. Finn Grattan, in their book, talks about the phenomenon of social camouflaging and has found this to be more true in people designated female at birth who are on the autism spectrum. And that they will also often go overboard to accommodate to the social environment and camouflage who they really are, which means that for some of them, they bury their authentic gender identity until it can no longer remain dormant, and then it either slowly moves to the surface or explodes out of the surface. And so that's an inhibitor. The social camouflaging often becomes an inhibitor to gender exploration. Now, there is also one other thing, and this does have to do with being in a world where you're not always reading everything that's going on about you, even though in sensory terms you're very sensitive, like wearing a witch hat to keep away the dark light, the bright lights. Is you may not read danger signals when they're in front of you. Being transgender is a wonderful thing for all of us to celebrate and support, but not everybody thinks the way we do. So there are, as we know, not just suicidality for transgender people, violence and murder of transgender people, beyond rejection to actual actions. So that we really have to make sure for all youth that they can keep themselves safe, but we may have to do an extra measure for double helix rainbow kids. And so here's what we have discovered at our UCSF Child and Adolescent Gender Center Clinic, that indeed the gender as a thing often does not pop up to puberty. And so we have kids coming to the clinic with very confused parents saying, I never saw this coming. There were no indications whatsoever of any gender nonconformity, gender diversity. And one day my child woke up and said to me, I'm not a girl, I'm a boy. What's the deal? So I want to read you one quote from a young adult to explain what's the deal. Because my gender identity is something approximating non-gendered, none of the above, I did not have the same sort of early childhood dysphoric experiences that someone male to female or female to male might. It was only in and after puberty when my body began to change further away from my sexless internal representations that I began to feel true gender dysphoria rather than mere dissatisfaction at traditional gender roles. And it was not until college that I encountered the concept of being genderless or third gender and finally found an identity that actually fit. So we have to know that Because it doesn't show up in early childhood for many of our double helix rainbow kids, it's still as real can be, and it is authentic. Now I want to flip it. We have found at our gender clinic that this is the first time that an adolescent may be considered for a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. They have never received the diagnosis before. They've gotten a lot of other diagnoses or a lot of other interventions for sensory issues or lack of attention or social anxiety. But it's in the course of the gender evaluation, gender health planning, that a question comes up. You're often to the parents, has your child ever been assessed for autism? We're seeing some indicators that your child may be neurodivergent. And indeed, when we refer out for a neuropsych evaluation, increasingly the answer is yes. This gender diverse person is also on the autism spectrum. And often some of the youth feel so relieved that finally someone is getting them in focus in both dimensions after struggling for many years undiagnosed, sometimes with parents getting angry at them, teachers getting frustrated with them because they can't go with the program as they're expected to. And I will say lastly that when gender shows up in a double helix rainbow kid, it is very common for it not to be binary, but to be either non-binary, agender, gender creative, or some creative idiosyncratic iteration of gender in its infinite possibilities. So that we have to be open to seeing gender as multiple. And it is absolutely the neurodivergent kids and adults who are teaching us about gender multiplicity, because despite what I said about some rigid black and white thinking that can set in, more often we see the full extent of gender creativity. So rule of thumb, working with the double helix rainbow kid is the same as for any other gender expansive kid, if we're going from that lens, which is it's not for us to say, but for them to tell us what their authentic gender is. And it may take a while to interpret what they're saying, but that's our job as clinicians. And our job is to step into their world, not demand that they conform to ours, starting from where they are about gender. And that involves all of us reviewing our own gender assumptions, our own biases, because they can get in the way of being able to step into somebody's gender world. And that correlates with maintaining exquisite respect for their way of seeing gender. And often then you can take small steps to even opening up to some of the ways you may see gender that you invite them to consider with you, so that it's collaborative. And I want to finish with just telling you a brief synopsis of one of my favorite, most heartwarming experiences at the Child and Adolescent Gender Center Clinic. So this was an 8-year-old child who came to us having been diagnosed at age 2 with severe autism. The child came from another country. Parents were immigrants, and who came to the first visit was the mother, the father, and the maternal grandmother, and the child. And during this visit, the child had very little verbal language, mostly hummed to themselves, had an iPad that they held to be able to keep them able to stay in the visit. And throughout the visit, they listened as their parents and grandmother explained the situation, which was that this little girl was insisting she was a boy. And the parents didn't know what to do. And their theory was that this child was obsessed with her older brother, and in her autistic way of thinking, wanted to become her older brother. And it was a phase, an obsessive phase. And the only thing this child said in any words throughout the session is, iPad, mama, which means give me the iPad, I need the iPad. Or when one of the three adults, mom, dad, or grandmother, would say, and she wants to, or she does, referring to this little girl, she would look up and say, don't say she, say he. That was the only sentence said in the entire session. What was discovered was an 8-year-old little girl was now in Tanner stage 2 of puberty. And when the family found that out, the grandmother said, having nothing to do with gender, that cannot happen. I've just heard you say that within a year she may start menstruating. She's terrified of blood. She absolutely can't get a small cut on her hand. She will be traumatized by menstruation. So the intervention was, because she's still qualified, she's just at the end stage of precocious puberty at age 8, that the endocrinologist, with the parents' approval, put her on puberty blockers to staunch puberty going forward. So puberty was put on halt. And at the same time, we referred the family to a gender specialist in their community. And so this child started working with a gender specialist who understood autism to do a deep dive on what's going on with gender here. 9 months later, this child came in for one of their follow-up visits. This child now had changed their name from a female to a male name, used he, him pronouns. And the same child who made no eye contact and just shrunk away from any of us on the interdisciplinary team walked into the clinic from the waiting room to our clinic office wearing their karate uniform, made direct eye contact with us, shook my hand, and said, "How are you?" Now, I've been doing this work working with kids since the 1970s. I have never seen such a radical transformation in a child in all the work I've ever done under the umbrella of autism. And what it made me realize is that by affirming this child's gender articulations and facilitating the social transition, not only is this child feeling more comfortable in their authentic gender, we had reduced the social stressors that come along with an autism diagnosis. Autism is still there, but the ability to be socially engaged, to have physical contact, to make eye contact, surged remarkably over those 9 months. So this is my conclusion, and then I think it's time to open up for our questions. Our gender affirmation can serve to reduce the stressors that come with being neurodivergent, and that the child now has the ability to live in the gender that's authentic to them, reducing social anxiety and enhancing social skills. So we have removed one impairment for a double helix rainbow kid when we do that, and that is their gender dysphoria, perhaps even giving them the opportunity for gender euphoria. So I will stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Casey, did you want to follow up?
Oh, no, go for it.
Oh, I was just going to open it up to questions. Please put them in the chat or feel free to unmute yourselves. I do want to say one thing. Casey, I love your graphics for your PowerPoint presentation. They were so lovely and creative, and a breath of fresh air. So thank you.
Appreciate it.
Besides the fact that the content was actually very, very nice.
It always helps to make it colorful. Yeah, I gotta give a shout out to Lauren Hack, who put me onto that program. It's a really great PowerPoint. Any questions out there? Either in the chat or unmute.
I think I do see one question, Casey, that came early on, and it's really about gender. It's about if being gender non-binary, if it varies by culture, or just gender by culture.
I was struck just by the change in culture from time historically. So, you know, in your article about the psychoanalytic component of it, the story about the kids who were brought up, you know, boy, girl, binary, and then a more recent trend of saying, you know, there are X people and XY people. And some XX people are boys and girls, and some are XY people are girls and boys. And that allowing for a youngster to have the freedom to understand that they fit into the societal explanation of gender. It was a pretty good shift to see, and it was much more supportive than the prior binary. I didn't know the cultures of those two stories, but it just felt as it has shifted just overall in society.
And I would say there's definitely been a shift. And I just heard this account this week from two parents, a mom and a dad, and they have a transgender little girl who is now 5 years old. And she is aware of her genitals, and she's aware of her parents' genitals. And she asked her mom, "So, mommy, when you were a little girl, you had a penis too?" So her developmental understanding is when she grew up, her penis would turn into a vagina as she grew her breasts, because her mom had breasts and a vagina. So that was probably going to be what happened for her. And it was just a matter of development. So that was her own creative understanding of gender, rather than I can't be a girl because I have a penis.
Another reason that this work is so great, there's just so many creative and supportive ways in which to describe this.
And, you know, one of the things I was just going to mention is that if you're kind of a general mental health practitioner, not a gender specialist, if you've never seen a gender diverse child or a transgender child, you will, because they're everywhere. Or you have and you didn't know it. And if you work with autistic youth, and that is your lens and your area of practice, and you've never seen a gender diverse child within your autism practice, you will. And if you work as a gender specialist and you say, "I've never worked with autism," you better get some training, because it is critical that you understand the interface between gender and neurocognitive development. And I will give you an example when it goes south really badly. Here's the bad ending to the story I just told you that sounded like it had such a happy ending. And this is the little child who came in at age 9, shaking hands. This child had been on puberty blockers for a while, went back to their community, which is just in Central California, found at some point there was time for a new evaluation. So it was going to be a consolidated gender and neuropsych evaluation. They found someone who was a so-called gender specialist as a child was actually approaching a puberty. And this evaluator evaluated for gender in the following way with this severely autistic child who still had very little verbal language. Brought out 2 dolls, naked dolls, one with a penis, one with a vagina. Because this child could not identify that the child with the penis was a boy and the child with the vagina was a girl, her report back to the parents, which is really actually what they were hoping to hear, was this child couldn't possibly know their gender if they don't know which genitals go with which gender. So your child is not transgender. The child was taken off puberty blockers and cut off contact with our clinic. And as much as we tried to reach out, no return calls. And so we can only imagine that that little boy got lost to us and to himself. So therefore, if you're a gender specialist, understand neurodivergent ways of thinking and being about gender.
Can you talk a little about the difficulty that there must arise with so many autistic kids who have very limited language, some have no language? How do you see them presenting the gender issues when they really can't talk about it very clearly?
Casey, did you want to take that one?
I'll let you on that one. You're more experienced.
Here's how I see it. Like, for example, with this child, it was one sentence. Don't say she, say he. But for other kids, it's in their actions. They'll go like into their brother's closet and just take their clothes and put them on. They might take a scissors and cut their own hair. But so it will often be an action or tearing a dress off. That's a message. And the ex post, so it's really often in my office, I do same work. And kids who don't have language, they play it out in the sand with very few words, or drawings, or music. So it's a challenge. But I have to say it's a challenge with all kids who really translate what they're telling us about their gender. Because we say it's not for us to tell, it's for the children to say, and then we go to what the hell are they saying? So what with a child who's a double helix rainbow kid, it is like working with any autistic kid. How do you communicate? How do you develop a close, a trusting relationship? I remember one child I worked with having nothing to do with gender. The only way that we could be in connection with each other is if he stood in the corner of my office with his nose into the wall, in the corner with his back to me, and that and I had to be across the room and sing bluegrass. So I think creatively, but definitely, I think you asked such an important point is don't depend on language.
Well, you gave us so much to think about, and I really appreciate that call to continue our own professional development and education as a necessity and not as a, we're gonna see these children and we better be equipped to respond to them appropriately, effectively, and with justice in terms of their care. So I really appreciate that. And Casey, I really appreciated your calling out your social location at the beginning of your talk and identifying yourself and your work, your group, and where you come from in the perspective to the in relation to the work that you do. So I really appreciate that. I wish more speakers would do that. So much respect for doing that. Thank you. We should wrap up. It is 1 o'clock. Thank you very much to you both. It's been a great pleasure. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
And thank you all.
Yeah, thank you so much.